For centuries, wars have been fought by soldiers in national uniforms. But today, there are new players on the battleground. Private military companies have played an increasing role in global conflicts. For the soldier with no flag, modern warfare is a lucrative trade. But some of these companies have committed atrocities and other human rights abuses. The 2007 Nice Square massacre shone a light on the actions of these shadowy groups.
17 people died here in September 2007 when contractors from US security firm Blackwater unleashed a bloodbath.
A 9-year-old boy was one of the 17 victims shot dead by Blackwater officers, a PMC that had won over $1 billion worth of US contracts over the course of the war in Iraq. Today, PMCs are used across the globe, and business is booming. Russia uses them in the Middle East and Africa. China is using them to protect its Belt and Road Initiative project. And even radical Islamists have entered the PMC game, with companies like Malhama Tactical offering training to jihadi groups, as seen in this Channel 4 documentary. And when things get messy, countries can blame contractors or deny their involvement. So how are nations allowed to fight these shadow wars and evade international law? And what happens when soldiers of fortune are given corporate backing? This is the story of the private military company's system error. The private military industry that exists today has its roots in the 20th century. In post-colonial African countries, mercenaries became notorious for mounting coups, putting down rebellions, and committing abuses.
Small groups or individuals who were performing acts of war or espionage, doing so as individuals, soldiers of fortune.
In 1963, communist rebels in the Congo launched a rebellion, but were crushed by mercenaries.
They run. They can't take what we've got.
Led by a South African called Mad Mike Hoare, initially hired by Moise Chombe, a Congolese businessman who ended up forming a secessionist government. Mad Mike claimed that he and his men had killed between 5,000 and 10,000 people, and was later featured in a BBC interview.
The greatest thrill I get, of course, is the command of men. I'm talking about real men. Not a whole flock of Nancy boys. I mean the real McCoy.
Decades of human rights abuses committed by mercenaries like Mad Mike eventually led to the 1989 UN Mercenary Convention. This attempted to ban the use of mercenaries, but the convention could be sidestepped by avoiding the term mercenary and giving the old guns for hire a corporate makeover.
And they drew the definition so tightly that, in effect, almost anyone could say and be correct from a legal perspective that they were not a mercenary. By having that corporate structure and being under contract to a legitimate government.
The ban unwittingly created a roadmap for the creation of private military companies. PMCs begin to change from simple contractors to the corporations we see today. After the Cold War, this change accelerated. The world was flooded with unemployed soldiers and arms from the US and Russia.
There was a market niche where former soldiers and commanders in particular had a skill set that they believed would be useful and marketable to states that were willing to buy them.
Interstate conflict was replaced by smaller revolutionary and ethnic civil wars, all of which created a security vacuum that PMCs could step into.
Military functions were offloaded into contingency contracts.
By the 1990s, governments had come to view PMCs as a key foreign policy tool, a way to bypass international laws to exert influence abroad. In the Yugoslav Civil War, the US used a private company to train the Croatian army.
Croatian troops have made significant gains, punching through Serb defense in several places.
By using a PMC, the US was able to avoid a UN embargo on countries providing military support to the warring sides. The contracted PMC, known as MPRI, was accused of abetting the genocide of ethnic Serbs caught up in fighting. When Serbs later attempted to sue MPRI a decade later, their case was thrown out of a US court as the alleged events occurred outside US jurisdiction. The difficulty in prosecuting PMCs has led to a wild west where private military contractors operate with impunity.
A lot of the initial UN effort was to try to cull these mercenaries and get the statute approved. And so there was a big debate about how to even talk about them, which extended really until the middle of the 2000s.
The 1989 convention finally became law in 2001, but only 37 countries have signed up, and major players like the US, UK, Russia, and China refused. That same year, the attack on the World Trade Center triggered a war on terror that saw an explosion in the use of PMCs.
I asked your Secretary of Defense a couple months ago what law governs their actions. Mr.
I was going to ask him. Go ahead. Help.
Private military contracts allowed the government to avoid congressional limits on troop numbers and reduce the official death toll, as their fatalities are not included in government figures. This means the public is often not aware of the true financial and human cost of war. Since 2001, 1,000 more contractors have died in Iraq and Afghanistan than U.S. troops.
The American military was being strained significantly, but they had built into place, primarily throughout the 1990s, this ability to bring in additional contract support employees. And that model was also being adopted by our allies.
The Bush administration would eventually employ more than 155,000 contractors in Iraq alone. But notorious abuses involving PMCs continue to emerge.
يعني أسلوب من أساليبهم إنه القبض التناسلي للرجل يلفون عليه حبل ويجروه هيك مثل عملية الخنق.
The torture of prisoners at Abu Ghraib prison shocked the world and involved private military contractors from CACI and Titan.
شنو الداعي لأنه جيش يستعين بشركات أمنية مدنية للتحقيق مع معتقلين؟
CACI and Titan have so far avoided prosecution and demonstrate how easy it is for PMCs to avoid being held accountable for human rights abuses. Their status as a company operating during times of war shields them from prosecution under both international and US law. In addition, the war-ravaged countries they operate in, like Iraq, are often reluctant to bring charges against the very entities helping them in their reconstruction efforts.
American contractors working in Iraq 15, 20 years ago were operating under U.S. law to the extent that U.S. law governed their activities overseas, and operating under the legal regime that was put in place during the American occupation and administration of Iraq during that period of time before the transfer of sovereignty.
More concerning, however, is that a new type of PMC has entered the battlefield, one that has made prosecution for alleged abuses almost impossible. Since 2014, the Wagner Group has been helping Russia advance its interest abroad, from helping Russian troops annex Crimea to supporting Bashar al-Assad in Syria.
It's kind of like a way of operating for Putin to sort of, be able to use this group in order to carry out things that he wouldn't otherwise be able to do.
In 2018, they allegedly attacked U.S. forces in Syria, a claim the Kremlin denied.
The Russian high command in Syria assured us it was not their people, and my direction to the chairman was for the force then was to be annihilated. And it was.
Sir. What makes accountability particularly difficult is the way the group is formed. It is not a registered company, but instead a group of interconnected businesses that have no direct link to the Kremlin and are allegedly financed by one of Putin's closest allies. Today, there is still no specific international body to regulate the actions of PMCs, and incidents of abuse are rarely prosecuted. As the lines between warfare, terrorism, and organized crime have become increasingly blurred, so have their operations.
We should really question how much we've seen, kind of under the rug, because it's not as transparent. You can't find out as much about this industry as you can about military forces.
If I could really fix this, I would essentially deputize them, incorporate them, hold them accountable by bringing them into the actual armed forces. It will take a lot of time, a few generations, and many more bad things happening before things are corrected.